Hi, everyone, and welcome back to That UFO podcast. My name is Andy, and this is a breaking news podcast with my immediate reactions after the UAP hearings from today. Now, this will be a shorter podcast, just getting some of my initial thoughts, some of what happened, some of what was said, and then later on today, I'm recording a breakdown with Dan. By the time this comes out, we'll probably be recording, but I've got a lot of reaction in anyway. So any thoughts you send will be used for a show later in the week. So you're going to get this instant reaction, talking through what happened. You're going to get a breakdown tomorrow with myself and Dan going through the hearings with some listener thoughts, questions, and a little bit more. And then as the week goes on, further digesting of what happened. Now, these are just my instant thoughts. I've got some notes here I tried to take as I went through. I think folks went into this hearing, largely speaking, with very low expectations, had been disappointed by the previous hearings we've had, especially the last one in November 2024. There was a sense of underwhelmment, if that's even a word, afterwards. Whether that's fair or unfair, I'll leave it up to you to decide. However, I think what we've seen from the initial reaction, and I say initial because that can change as hours and days and weeks pass, this one has landed perhaps in a more positive light. And I think a lot of that is down to the fact, let me just check my microphone here, folks. I think a lot of that is down to the fact that people went in with such low expectations and the witnesses weren't big names. You can argue George Knapp is a big name, but there was a lot of dubiety around him being there. I think it's pleasantly surprised a lot of people. I'm pretty positive with it, and I like to think I'm fair. I'm really intrigued to hear what Dan's got to say later on it. Purposely, as usual, don't message about it. So I'm looking forward to hear what he says. And we did get some videos, and we did get a new video that's going to cause a lot of debate. Again, instant reaction, really interesting. But we'll get to that. Let me go through first what happened. So 10 a.m. In the Capitol today. Representative Anna Paulina Luna, she kicked things off with a statement, and part of that statement, like I say, I'm not going to go through things word for word. It was over 2.5 hours, folks, so if I miss anything out, if I slightly get something wrong, forgive me. I'm going to go through it as best I can here. She called out Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick, former Arrow director, as, and I'll quote this, a documented liar. That's something that later in the hearing, right towards the end, they basically say they want to subpoena Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick and question him under oath. And Kirkpatrick and Arrow get a bit of a kicking as things go along here. Mentioned multiple senior officials during her statement, an opening statement, from senators to congressmen and women to officials, and how much they feel the people coming forward, the whistleblowers, are credible and why they should be listened to. We then have, and let me just get here, folks, I've got a list of folks who were involved in this. A Ms. Crockett, and she is Jasmine Crockett, an oversight Democrat. She comes in with a statement, touches on NASA having not found anything, the formation of Arrow, mentions that while some reports are explainable, balloons and whatnot, we need to track down each UAP. She was given hint there that, it's not good enough just to say that some things are or aren't explainable. And then we had a Miss Titus, who makes a statement praising George Knapp. I felt there was a little bit of a chemistry between Miss Titus and George Knapp there. Gave a glowing career reference, very much there to big up George Knapp on that one. And that was the intro, and we got right into things. Now, what I'll do here, folks, is early on, the witnesses read their statements. I'll see if I can include the audio in the breakdown or at the end of the breakdown, perhaps, with the statements being read out by each person. But what I'll do is just kind of break down what each statement said from each of the witnesses. So first up was Jeff, and I always say Nuccetelli, but that's incorrect. It's Nuccetelli. So Jeff Nuccetelli, Vandenberg Air Force Base. He's a former Air Force military police officer with 16 years service. He emphasised in his statement that Americans have both the right and responsibility to know the truth about UAP, and that truth is being suppressed by classification, fear, stigma, and confusion. He notes his Vandenberg Air Force Base UAP incidents that he's been interviewed about the Red Square one really famously on this podcast and others, from October 2003, talks about a massive glowing red square hovered over the missile defence areas, drifted, vanished behind hills, and official records of the sighting are now held by Arrow and the FBI. Now, for that incident, Jeff's job was to collect evidence from those who had witnessed it, and he passed that on. He talked about rectangular craft. Security guards reported rapid, bright objects, which ended in a panic. It's coming right at us. Now it's here, they said, only for the object to vanish minutes later. Described by witnesses as bigger than a football field, hovering silently. You know, that's a big statement to hear in this setting. Even if you listening or watching this have heard that from Jeff before, to hear that in this setting, you've got folks from the public and officials hearing this for the first time. And that's pretty cool. Talked about lights over the ocean and a triangular craft in 2005. He talked about his own personal encounter. He had a glowing blue-white orb that first looked like a satellite, moved with unnatural agility, appeared, vanished, reappeared 200 feet above his house, receding for over 40 seconds and blending off with the night sky. He states these are not misidentifications or rumours. All of these were real unresolved encounters above a top tier national security installation that he's reported on. He gives some calls to action again, and just to note, folks, these statements are submitted in advance, so you could read these the day before on the Oversight website. They then read them as part of their opening. He mentioned 3 essential reforms. Number 1, fund independent UAP research. Number 2, end secrecy and overclassification. Number 3, protect whistleblowers. Remember, folks, this hearing's title was Restoring Public Trust Through UAP Transparency and Whistleblower Protection. That whistleblower protection theme comes up repeatedly, as you would expect. The final message from Jeff was, these encounters challenge our fundamental assumptions about reality, consciousness and humanity's place in the cosmos. And he urges, let this be the moment when America chooses courage over fear, transparency over secrecy, and progress over stagnation. Next up was Chief Alexandro Wiggins' written statement. Alexandro Wiggins appeared on the Weaponized podcast with Jeremy Corbell and George Knapp just a couple of months ago, talking about an incident. Alexandro Wiggins is a US Navy Senior Chief Petty Officer with 23 years of active duty service aboard the USS Jackson. Really interesting, and this is called out later on by one of the representatives. He is the first person to testify at these hearings who is still in active duty, and that's a big thing to do. It's a brave thing to do as well. So yeah, he's got to go back to his job tomorrow, the day after. Maybe he's got some annual leave in this week. I don't know. But yeah, he's doing this still in active duty. So he talks about February 15th, 2023, a sighting that happened around 7:15 Pacific time in the W291 pilot training zone off of Southern California. That area is particularly interesting and has come up time and time again, hasn't it? Talks about a tic-tac shaped object emerged from the ocean, a transmedium event, joined by 3 similarly shaped craft. All 4 departed together near instantaneously without any sonic boom or visible propulsion and disappeared from radar immediately upon leaving. He talked about this data being collated and corroborated across multiple sensors, including radar, recorded visually via the ship's systems with embedded timestamps and precise geographic coordinates that are all in the published video frames as part of that as well. So yeah, really, I'm not going to go through the whole thing again word for word. They're pretty lengthy statements. He talks about that multi-sensor validation being a big thing. Historical context. He notes that such sightings in that area, including the famous Tic Tac report from November 2004, is really, really key. He stressed the need for structured, stigma-free observations and reporting mechanisms. He said the event was recorded, passed up the chain of command via the standard reporting process. He later shared public details with Jeremy Corbell and George Knapp on the Weaponized show to ensure accurate documenting and to encourage other similar service members to share their own experiences without fear. We then had George Knapp's written testimony coming in. George Knapp kind of broke from his statement to go a little bit freestyle, which was interesting. He got the time to do that, and I did enjoy that. And listen, folks, I'll be biased here. I'm a big fan and supporter of George Knapp. I think that's probably quite a popular opinion. There are plenty of folks who aren't big fans of various folks. However, I think George Knapp came across incredibly well here. And if you felt underwhelmed by Michael Schellenberger and his appearance and kind of non-role in the last hearings where he presented the documentation from Immaculate Consolation and all the furore that followed that, Knapp was a big part of this hearing. And these congressmen and women wanted to hear from Knapp. They wanted his opinion. And I was really, really happy. So obviously George Knapp, if you didn't know, is a reporter at KLS TV in Las Vegas. He has over 4 decades of service reporting on the UFO topic. When I interviewed George last time I spoke to him, we talked a little bit about his background in reporting on the mafia out in Vegas, and that is no mean feat. If you think UFOs are scary, reporting on the Vegas mafia must be right up there as well with intimidation and whatnot. Knapp talks about reporting on UAPs and how the FOIA document trove, paper trails, looking at agencies like the Air Force, the CIA, the FBI, NASA, all claim nothing to worry about, nothing to see here. He believed, looking at it, the records tell a different story. Officials privately acknowledge these phenomena are real, they fly in formation, they are evasive, and they outperform any known aircraft. And that has happened through the decades and still does to this day. He does talk about Bob Lazar. That name comes up really early on, his relationship with Senator Harry Reid. He highlights the OSAP programs. He brings in the Bigelow Aerospace, data. He talks about Dr. James Lakatsky, over 250,000 UAP case files being reported. In the body of what happened, Knapp names names as well, which I think will get a lot of folks talking, and we will see, hopefully, a lot of follow-up off the back of that too. And I'll get into that when I speak to Dan later on today, that you'll hear tomorrow. And yeah, he talked a lot about Soviet-era programs as well from the USSR, a follow-on project by the Soviets called Thread 3, easy for me to say, which was a big data collecting operation by the USSR, perhaps the biggest ever across the world, that then had sub-programs underneath it as well. Really interesting stuff. Dylan Borland was another witness. Dylan Borland's name came up, and a lot of folks last week when we saw this were a bit perplexed as to who Dylan Borland was. I managed to find at the time his details on LinkedIn, and he is indeed a former US Air Force geospatial intelligence specialist. He worked as a senior analyst at BAE Systems and Intrepid Solutions. He identifies as a federal whistleblower, and really interestingly, we hear from Mr. Borland that he first approached Arrow to whistleblow back in 2023, March of 2023, and he goes into detail in the hearing, which we'll get to, around his issues with reporting to Arrow, what he can and can't say. And he reminded me a lot of Matthew Brown, whistleblower Matthew Brown, who was sat right behind George Knapp next to Jeremy Corbell for this hearing. Shame we couldn't hear from Matthew Brown as well. But Mr. Borland, he talks about, what he can and can't say. He talks about having an encounter where he witnessed a craft around 100 foot long in 2012 at Langley Air Force Base, an equilateral triangle. Hovered silently above him around 100 feet, interfered with his telephone. He talks really interestingly, folks, about the craft having like a matte black or really intense black paint job almost. I'll just say paint job. But separately, there was almost like a gold glowing aura around and going over the craft. We have heard that kind of explanation or description before, so really interesting. I think Dylan Borland's going to come across really well from this, and we do need to hear more from Dylan. He had for me, a genuineness to his testimony, and I really enjoyed hearing from him. And in the Discord chat that I was part of during the hearing, if you're on the Patreon, the Apple, you pay for the podcast, you get access to that. So thanks to everyone who was in there. He came across so well, really well. So yeah, Dylan Borland. And then last minute, folks, we had a surprise witness thrown in yesterday, less than 24 hours before the session. Joe Spielberger Spielberger, not Spielberg, no relation. He is a seasoned senior policy counsel at Project on Government Oversight, or POGO, and he was added to the roster, like I say, last night. That news broke as I record this. His presence signalling whistleblower protections and transparency are not just timely topics, but they need to be urgent priorities for the folks involved in these hearings. He is a trusted whistleblower advocate. POGO is a non-partisan watchdog resolutely focused on exposing corruption, misuse of power and silencing truth-tellers. He's got decades of experience advocating for whistleblowers. So a bit left field, but he might not have been the sexiest UAP whistleblower to bring in or name. A lot of folks may have wanted Matthew Brown in that seat instead for the content of what he may have said. But again, remember the title of this hearing is about whistleblower protections as well. So it was important to have someone in there who really knows what he's talking about. And he came across incredibly well. He talked about whistleblowers being the government's first line of defence in his statement. National security whistleblowers face systematic disadvantages. He mentioned retaliation harms more than just the individuals. Spielberger talked about targeting whistleblowers not only damages individuals, but discourages others and erodes agency integrity and stalls necessary accountability. And accountability is something that seems to be missing wildly across this conversation and one of these big things from the hearing. And as part of his statement to finish off, he said he urged Congress to reaffirm bipartisan support for whistleblowers regardless of political wins and to prioritise evidence over individual narratives. Strengthening whistleblower protection, he argues, is fundamental to good governance and public trust. So yeah, really interesting. Dylan Borland at the end of his statement got a fantastic ovation and round of applause. One of the listeners who was there, Paul, he was in attendance at the hearing. He was messaging me during the hearing too to say David Grush was in attendance. You catch him on camera a couple of times behind members of Congress in the stand. And Paul said that Grush was talking with members of Congress before the hearing. They were hugging him. They were listening intently. And it really makes you wonder, in this hearing, how big was David Grush's influence? He is someone that we've all pined, I think, to hear more from over the last couple of years. However, is his influence being felt in a much bigger way behind the scenes? So I'm wondering, folks, do you think that's been nearly 20 minutes? I wonder if at that point I'll leave it and I'll come back to the breakdown to speak with Dan. But that was the statements, and there was a video. Let me just chat on the video first. So one of the real big talking points that's going to come from this is Representative Eric Burleson introduces a video, and the video shows an MQ-9 drone. Let me just find this exactly so I get this correct, because at this time I was bursting for the loo. However, I managed to stay for the video and whatnot and kick off. So video. I'm leaving this in, folks, because it's opinion. So the video showed an MQ-9 drone tracking an orb, and that is their language, off of the coast of Yemen. He mentions another MQ-9 drone launches a Hellfire missile from the side. You don't see that other drone, but you see the orb come in, the missile come in. I'm going to play the video in the corner here if you're on the YouTube. It seems, and it's difficult at this moment in time to go off of, and I'm just talking about what we see. Lots of chatter online about what it may or may not be. You see what appears to be the missile hit the object, it knocks it, a couple of bits come off the object, and then it carries on moving. The drone filming pans out and zooms out, and you get a bigger view, and it seems to be the object carries on. It genuinely does seem that 3 smaller bits come off of the object and almost go along in formation, either as a defence or following it. It doesn't look like debris, and they do seem to fly alongside it, folks. And you know me with the orb thing, I'd be the first one to rip it apart. Whole load of explanations no doubt will come out for this, but it's a really intriguing video at face value. And again, this was one I saw a lot of folks wary about getting videos beforehand. Joe Khalil reporter on Twitter or X broke that news last night that I saw, or a couple of days ago, where we're going to get some videos. This has had a good reaction. It's certainly got people talking, even some of the more sceptical folks in the Discord. were really impressed with this one. So let me leave it there, folks. That's the initial reaction. That's my thoughts. And over the next week or so, I've got lots of guests coming on. I'd love to hear your thoughts and questions on the hearing when you've had a chance to watch, on the video when you've had a chance to watch, and from the fallout and where do we go from here. Looking forward in a couple of hours from now, recording with Dan, a breakdown on the hearing, going into some more detail, have some back and forward, and share some opinion from you listeners as well, from the Patreon post, from the Discord chat. And yeah, really looking forward to that. So thank you for listening, folks, to this reaction. That's what we had, a really interesting hearing. I would say it's up there. Don't think it's perhaps in the same level as the Grush hearing, but perhaps this is the second best one we've had so far. Let me know your thoughts, and I'll speak to you all very, very soon.